Hello and welcome back. My name is Ryan Wallner. This is another Portworx Lightboard session. And today we're going to be talking about capacity management, aka PX Autopilot. And specifically, we're going to dig in on the pool expansion capacity management that allows you to add disks automatically based on a rules engine. So, what do I mean by that? Autopilot and capacity management with Portworx focuses on the automation around managing your capacity and those operations, such as adding disks, expanding PVCs, or expanding the disks within a pool. And those operations are typically done by scripts or manually, and we've made this sort of a way to do as a native way within Kubernetes to define it as a YAML file and allow Portworx to take over and do it for you. So the way that we go ahead and do this is after you've initially configured Portworx, which we'll say you'll have one underlying disk, say 100 gigabytes each. On the initial deployment, say we're in cloud, this is something like EBS. That makes our initial Portworx storage pool for our PVCs at 300 gigabytes. Now, applications are going to be running and using PVCs, and probably as time goes on, more and more applications, more databases, more stateful services are going to start on Kubernetes. So as they start to use up this capacity, say they start to, use about 150 gigabytes of space, that's about half your available capacity. So you start thinking about, okay, how am I going to manage this, and how is it going to, when am I going to trigger doing these types of operations? Well, here's where Autopilot comes in. So when you deploy Portworx, to use Autopilot, you're going to need Prometheus. If you're not familiar with Prometheus, this is sort of a way to gather statistics about applications running in Kubernetes, or Portworx itself uses this as well. The way that it does this is Portworx provides an API that has a Prometheus endpoint, and that endpoint provides stats to Prometheus. And Prometheus can view things like the number of volumes, the total capacity, the used bytes, and things like that, CPU and memory. And Autopilot also, when configured with Portworx, taps in, I'm going to label this AP for Autopilot, taps in to Prometheus metrics by polling those metrics. And in turn, the Autopilot program can manage Portworx by providing the operations automation based on the metrics and the rules engine is within Autopilot itself. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what this control loop looks like and how Autopilot actually detects these types of things, we have to actually create a rule, right? So for Portworx, what you do is take an expression that Prometheus is aware of that you could tell Autopilot about. So say we have bytes used. These are shorthand, not the actual ones, but we'll provide links to the actual ones, to total bytes. So this gives me a sense of the amount of capacity I have left. So we could say that when the amount of capacity I have left is greater than 60%, meaning I've used more than 60% of my total capacity pool, then we provide a action. And so these actions have a couple different parts, which we'll say is to expand in this case, because we want to expand our cluster. but we have a type of expansion, which is add disk. You can also provide this type of rule with a upper limit, meaning expand my cluster every time it reaches 60% capacity, which might only happen a few times, but do it by a certain percentage. So we can say expand by 50%, meaning increase my total capacity by 50% once I've reached 60. But you can also say never more than, say, 2 terabytes per pool. So say that you don't want to, you have a cost limitation of, we can expand this cluster, we can allow this rule to do something automated, but we don't want it to just, blatantly kind of start expanding if there's a rogue process using a lot of data. There's also ways to tell this kind of rule with Autopilot to kind of hold off, meaning do the expansion, and if you do have a rogue application, it won't set off the action within a certain time period. So there's a number of different configurations there, but the biggest ones are kind of the rule, the action, by how much, and the type, and we're going to be talking about adding a disk. So as the pool grows above our, say, 60%, which is kind of right here, right? So once it reaches this 60%, Prometheus is going to notice this, and therefore Autopilot's going to trigger that rule and say, hey, I noticed we've reached this threshold, so now we have to take this action. This action in this case is to grow the pool. So what happens is, because it is a type of add disk, it'll grow your pool by, remember, 50%, which, in this case, 50% of 300 is 150. So it'll now grow to, we'll just kind of extend here to 450 gigabytes. And so this percentage now is slashed because Portworx automatically grew this pool. Now we're actually using under 60%. That rule still stays in place in case you use more storage down the road. But now what we've effectively done is allow this rule and Autopilot to automatically control the underlying storage provider like AWS or Azure or VMware vSphere to provision the disks, attach them, and add them to the pool, and make sure everything is kind of spread out and repopulated, right? So again, this is specifically the add disk type, and pretty self-explanatory. It adds a physical disk to the underlying infrastructure and allows Portworx to gain the extra space for the total pool for your PVCs. Stay tuned. We'll talk about other ones like disk expansion, which doesn't add this separate disk, but expands the existing one by one till your pool reaches a capacity you want. And PVCs, we'll also talk about those. So hopefully this made sense with capacity management, Autopilot, and adding disks to grow your pool automatically. Until next time, take care.